If God is all-loving, loves everyone, everything perfectly, if God is perfectly powerful, sometimes we use the word omnipotent, other times sovereign, almighty, then why wouldn't a powerful and loving God prevent these kinds of evils? Most people that I know don't think God necessarily causes them, at least not cause them directly. But the bigger question is, why wouldn't God stop them or prevent them if they were genuinely evil? My big claim for the day that I want to try to defend is that this self-giving, others-empowering, and therefore what I call uncontrolling love, or I sometimes call it essential kenosis, plays the central role in solving the problem of evil. And if we accept this or affirm this particular view, then we can make better sense overall of God, that should say life, there's a typo there, God and life, than by affirming some other view. And I'll be drawing some from a couple of books that I've written. This one written more by an academic press, and this one just came out a few months ago, written more for a popular audience. But the claims that I'm going to be talking about today are either explicitly in these books, or I'm going to actually add some additional supplemental ideas to hopefully further the conversation. So as I was thinking about moving forward to this, trying to defend this fundamental claim about self-giving, others empowering, that uncontrolling love coming logically first in God, this essential kenosis, I thought it might be helpful for you to have an idea of what I'm calling background issues. That is, these are kind of the assumptions I have, some of the definitions I use for the terminology, so that you can get a better idea of where I'm coming from. First of all, one of the big ones is, what do we mean by evil? Here I want to distinguish between what some people call gratuitous or apparent evil and genuine evil. The definition of genuine evil I offer is, any event is genuinely evil if, all things considered, this event makes the world worse than it might have been had some other possible event occurred. So this is meant to encompass both moral evil, natural evil, and what I call creaturely evil. Anything that happens that makes the world worse than it might have otherwise been had some other really possible event happen. For instance, I could take my glass of water and throw it on Andreas. Now, is that a good or evil event? It might be hard to know. Maybe he's a little bit hot already, and he'd kind of like to be splashed by some water, and maybe he wouldn't think it's evil. Maybe, however, I also have a knife in my pocket, and I reach over and I begin to stab him. Most of us are going to think to ourselves, Tom didn't have to do that. The world could have gone on and some other possible event occurred in which Tom didn't stab Andreas. If the world could have been better and some other event was really possible, then the one that produces more ill-being or makes the world worse than it might have been is a genuine evil. Now, we might say, okay, that might be pretty subjective. Who's to decide? Who's going to have the perspective to decide whether or not the world really gets worse or not? Well, I'm going to suggest that every single one of us show by the way we act that we really do think some things happen in the world that are worse than it might have been. If we feel regret that we did something and wish we'd done something else, we assume that we could have done some other possible action. Or if we feel guilty, if, I don't know, you cheat on your spouse, and then you start feeling guilty. You're thinking to yourself, I didn't have to cheat on him or her. That suggests there was some other possible thing that could have happened. This might be an instance of genuine evil. Or if we look at someone else, if we say, you know what, that Donald Trump, he's acting wrong, badly, he doesn't care about the environment, this makes me outraged. I'm morally outraged. He ought to. We assume that he could actually care about the environment and act differently. And the fact that he doesn't is a genuine kind of evil. In fact, I want to make an even stronger claim. Every single one of us in this room lives our lives as if we believe some events are genuinely evil. I'll call this an experiential non-negotiable. If I followed you around throughout your lifetime, I would see evidence that you actually do things. Some things make the world worse than they might have been. Now, if you act like that's the case, then it seems you have, even if you're not sure, 100% sure it's genuinely evil, but if you act as if that's the case, then if you're going to have a consistent philosophy, you're going to have, and also believe in God, you're going to have to come to some kind of reconciliation of why this powerful and loving God wouldn't have prevented the genuine evil you see in the world. And if that's not enough, if you're someone like me who's a Christian, Christians seem to have built into their system the idea that humans can sin, and sin is a genuine evil, at least as sin is typically defined. You could define it a lot of different ways, but most Christians think of sin as doing something other than what God wants. And we think that God usually wants what's good, and so therefore it makes the world worse than it might have been. For all these reasons, I think genuine evils truly occur in the world. Even if sometimes we might disagree about whether or not throwing water on Andreas is genuinely evil, we all each act in our lives as if we think some things make the world worse than it might have been. Second thing is love. What do I mean by that word? The definition I provide is that to love is to act intentionally in empathetic or sympathetic response to God and others to promote overall well-being. Love's aim is to promote well-being. I think this way of thinking about God not only applies to love in the creaturely realm, this way of talking about love not only applies to love in the creaturely realm, but also to God. So some people try to solve the problem of evil by saying, well, it seems evil from our perspective, but from a God's eye view, it's really good, it's really loving. God's understanding of love is just not the same as our understanding. I'm taking that off the table right at the beginning. I'm saying, nope, the definition of love applies both to creator and to creature. Now, God, I think, loves in some ways differently than humans. I think God loves necessarily. I think creatures can choose whether or not we're going to love. So God loves by nature, we might say. I think God is everlasting, has no beginning and no end, whereas you and I have beginnings, at least, maybe not ends, but at least beginnings. And I think God loves absolutely everyone and everything. And one more important claim. To love is not only to act for the good of others, but I think it also implies that if we have the power to prevent evil, we would use that power. So not just acting benevolently to help Mikhail out, but also if someone is hurting Mikhail unnecessarily, and I have the ability to stop that, then if I really loved him, I would step in to stop him. So that's what love is about. Now a few other issues, just because I think these will come into play. First of all, I believe in true randomness or chance in the world. I think there's good scientific, philosophical, and experiential reasons to believe in chance. But I also believe in what many people call the natural laws. I like to call them law-like regularities because I'm a little suspicious of the language of natural laws. And I think these natural laws derive from God. Not, in my view, God voluntarily imposes them, but they are the inevitable or natural expressions of God's omnipresent love. We can talk about that if you want to go into details. I also believe that creatures, at least highly complex creatures, express some degree of freedom. I call it genuine but limited freedom. Less complex creatures, I think, have some measure of agency or self-organization, and even the simplest entities at the quantum level, we might say, possess at least the power to exist. I affirm genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and so I'm going to talk about the idea of possibility of that there's not strict determinacy even at that level, and that's going to make a difference as we talk about what's happening there. Also, just for good measure, I believe in things of values, that they're right and wrong, good and evil. They're not just totally in our head. I'm not saying I understand them all fully. I ground them in God like many theists do. But I have a notion of values in the world. Another important issue And that's the question of critical realism. I thought I need to put this up here because I know Andreas really cares about this issue, so do I. Critical realism can be defined in many different ways, but here's kind of a really basic way to talk about it. It says that we can actually know something true about the world beyond our own perception. We don't have to be solipsists. We can know something true, but we can't know the full truth of the world beyond ourselves. And I'm not sure we can even know those truths with absolute certainty. We can have certain probabilities or plausibilities, but we have some access, perception to the real world beyond ourselves, but we don't know everything, and we can't be 100% certain about that. Oops, I forgot to put those up there, sorry. And I apply that critical realism not only to the way we think about the world, but also to the way we think about God. I think we can actually know something about God through Scripture, through experience, through nature, through reason, all these kinds of things. But I don't think we can know everything or know God fully. And also, I doubt we can know these truths about God with epistemic certainty. We might have psychological certainty, but not epistemic certainty. So that's what I think about the question of realism. A similar issue is the question of God and mystery. We were talking about this last night. This is a quick, this is how I think about mystery. I don't think we can know the full truth of God. I just said that in the previous slide. And I don't think we can know with certainty even what we think we know about God. So we have to have faith. Not blind faith, but we have to have faith. In this, I think we can rightly appeal to mystery. There's going to be some mystery here. However, we shouldn't appeal to mystery to avoid rethinking our views of God or our model of God. So sometimes I think about it like this. On the big question of whether or not we can know God fully, I say no, and there's going to be mystery. But on the question of which model or which theology of God makes the most sense, we shouldn't have mystery in the models. Or at least the model that doesn't have mystery is going to be in some ways preferable to other models. I don't know what you're going to think about that, Vladimir, coming from your background, but we'll talk more about mystery if you have some questions. Okay, so two major claims now. I think an adequate solution to the problem of evil begins by making the claim that God's nature is love. I think I can do that by appeal to scriptures, even though not all sacred scriptures unequivocally speak of divine love. I've read the Bible enough to know there's some passages that paint a picture of God that isn't loving. I think the majority or the preponderance of scripture points to this. And I especially think the revelation of God in Jesus Christ suggests that God's nature is love. I could also go a perfect being theology approach if we wanted to do that. Obviously, I would start with love, but I could build on these certain moral intuitions that I think we have, or from our everyday experience with people we admire. Someone might accuse me of sort of a Feuerbachian projection, but I think there are certain intuitions we have that we all build upon when we think about God. And I could even go from a metaphysics of experience if I started going that direction. But that's just a way to begin by saying, my theory begins by saying God's nature is love. The controversial, perhaps, part of my series says this: God simply can't do some things. There's some things just God can't do. Some of them God can't do because they're logically contradictory. God can't make a married bachelor. God can't make a rock so big even God can't lift it. God can't make 2 + 2 = 397. But I also think that God can't do that which is immoral, which is very similar to the next one of saying God can't act contrary to God's nature. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this in a little bit, but just have it up there. The things God can't do are because they're either illogical or they oppose God's nature. And God can't oppose God's nature. And there are certain biblical passages that I would appeal to, especially if I'm in an audience that wants to get biblical support for this. The one I like the best is this last one here. When the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, he says, when you are faithless, God remains faithful because God cannot deny himself. That is, God can't contradict God's own nature. That particular issue, I think, is a major issue in theology that's not talked enough about. I think that we can begin to ask the question, what comes first in God? Now, by first, I don't mean like a hierarchy of dominoes. I mean logically first. What attribute or attributes should we begin with if we're going to try to make sense of God? Some people want to say, well, they're all equally valid. In reality, one begins to emerge if you start hanging out with this person long enough and looking at their theology. One of them begins to shape logically the others. In the history of theology, I think we've had two major choices. One is the idea that God's will or choice comes logically first. And if we take this to, and this is someone like William O. Ockham, I think John Calvin has this kind of approach. If we take this to its logical end, we could say things like, God could choose to stop existing because God's choice in whether to exist comes first. There's all kinds of other implications to that. The other option is to say, no, God's essence or nature is logically prior to God's will, so God doesn't even have a choice to stop existing because to exist is part of God's essence, and that comes first. In this particular category, we break it down further, and some people want to distinguish between God's natural attributes, things like God's aseity, that God exists necessarily. It's interesting the kinds of attributes that gets put there, like God's power is often put there, which is kind of weird because I think that is kind of a social attribute. But anyway, some people just want to say God's natural attributes are essential to God. Others want to say God's moral and natural attributes. So in this particular category, we might say, like I want to say, love is essential to God, and God must love. God could not choose not to love. I also want to say God creates, all kinds of things. Some people just want to stick to the natural attributes as essential. I want to say it's both moral and natural attributes. God loves by necessity because it's God's essence. God can't choose not to love. God must love because God's essence comes before God's will, and God's moral and natural attributes are included in this. And I even want to take one more step. I want to say that we can break this down further into the question of whether or not God's goodness, God's love, pertains only to God's self, whether or not you think that's a social trinity, or if you think God exists alone and not a social trinity, or God's self-love and creation love are also essential to God. This is a very controversial claim, one I'm going to affirm. That is, God by nature not only loves God's self, but loves creation, loves creaturely others. By necessity, God loves us. God loves the world. That's not a claim you find very often in theology. So all of these stem from this big question of what comes first logically in God. For me, it's the question of love. Love, I think, is God's nature. Love, God must love because love is not even a choice for God. It's who God is. And God's moral and natural attributes are going to necessarily be expressed, and in fact, amongst those, self-love and creation love are necessary expressions of God because they derive from God's nature. Or I put it this way. Love for creation and for God's self comes logically first in God's nature. Therefore, God necessarily loves creation and God's self. Now, that's a wild claim, a big one. Oftentimes at this point, someone asks me, okay, you just put the will over here. Are you saying God is not free in any sense? Are you saying that because God necessarily exists, necessarily loves God's self and the world, God has no freedom whatsoever? Most of the time we think love involves freedom in some sense. Here's where my being an open theist matters a lot. Because I think the future is truly future even for God. That is, God experiences time sequentially. moment by moment, just like we do. The past is past for us and past for God. The future is possibilities. It's not actual yet. And if that's the case, if the future is truly open, then we can say God can freely love in deciding how to respond moment by moment to the future. God faces this unknown and open future, and then God freely decides in every moment how to promote well-being. Or another way to put it is this: God freely chooses how to love, but God does not freely choose whether to love. God loves by nature, but God chooses how to love by nature, moment by moment. God doesn't know for sure exactly what's going to promote overall well-being in every single moment. God faces a realm of possibilities. God's motivated to act to promote well-being, and God's necessarily going to do that, but God has options to weigh in how best to promote well-being. Some of the options God could do aren't going to promote well-being in any much sense at all, so those really aren't on the table because God's only going to choose amongst the loving best. But because God can't know with certainty what the loving best is in every moment, God must freely choose amongst these options moment by moment. In that way, God has both freedom in how to love, but not freedom in whether to love. You and I, by contrast, we can freely choose whether we're going to love and freely choose how we're going to love. So we're different from God in that sense. One might even say this is the way God is transcendent over us. So, I think I'm going to skip this particular slide. Oh, except, no, I wanted to talk about these two really quick. This is the position that I'm going to be defending today. It says that God is essentially canonic. And probably the closest theological position to mine is this one here. It says that God voluntarily chooses not to intervene, chooses not to control, chooses not to be a sufficient cause to bring about some affairs. My position says God doesn't choose this. God necessarily cannot control because God's nature is uncontrolling love. So a few representatives of these positions. I'm in the middle here. John Polkinghorne is among many people in this particular position that says that God voluntarily makes a choice not to control us. Jürgen Moltmann would be in there. A lot of folks I could probably name. I mention these because I want to emphasize why my position makes a difference on the problem of evil. This particular view says that God could prevent evil if God wanted to, but for whatever reason, God chooses not to. My position says God simply can't single-handedly prevent evil. This one says God could. Someone like Philip Clayton believes that God created the world out of nothing and then made a decision never to control again. He called it the not even once theory. My position says no, God by nature can't control because love is inherently uncontrolling in God. And to illustrate the difference, here's a nice quote from John Polkinghorne. Got this in there for you. God allows the created other to be and to act so that all that happens is permitted by God's general providence. Not all that happens is in accordance with God's will or brought about by divine special providence. Such an understanding is basic to the interpretation of evolutionary history as creation's making of itself. Such an understanding is also basic to theodicy's disclaimer that God does not will the act of a murderer, moral evil, or the destructive force of an earthquake, natural evil, but allows both to happen in a world in which divine power is deliberately self-limited to allow causal space for creatures. I think this allow language and permit language makes it impossible for John Polkinghorne to solve the problem of evil, to solve the question of why doesn't a powerful and loving God sometimes become unself-limited to prevent genuine evil. And I actually like what John Calvin says in response to this position. He says, we should make no distinction between God's will and God's permission. What else is the permission of him who has the power of preventing and in whose hand the whole matter is placed, but his will? You see the tension there. I say God simply can't control others. Polkinghorne would say God could, but God allows that to happen. I don't think that allow language can solve the problem of evil, because then the question remains, why wouldn't a loving God become unself-limited and not allow, not permit? My God doesn't have that choice, because God necessarily, well, I'm getting to that next slide. God is essentially canonic. I'm drawing here from Philippians 2. You don't have to interpret the passage exactly the way I do, but that's where I'm talking about the kenosis stuff. I think that Jesus' kenosis reveals that God expresses self-giving, others-empowering love. What the passage doesn't explicitly say is whether or not this self-giving, others-empowering love is contingent in God or necessary in God. Does God do this by nature, or does God do this by will? What comes first in God? Does this self-giving, others-empowering love come logically first, or does the choice to do that come logically first? I make the claim, I should say most theologians say that God is voluntarily canonic, and I've already mentioned Polkinghorne. My view says that God necessarily expresses this self-giving, others-empowering, and therefore uncontrolling love. The implications then is, I should say, I'm not making the claim that somehow some exterior forces are constraining God. Sometimes, especially some of my process theologian friends, their language can sound as if there are principalities and powers or metaphysical laws or the God-world relationship or creativity. It sounds kind of like there's something outside of God constraining God. But I'm also not saying that God is voluntarily choosing not to control. I'm saying God's very nature, something God didn't choose, something that's eternal, God's very nature is self-giving, others-empowering love. Because love comes logically first in God's nature before God's choice and power. Which means that God's love necessarily shapes or preconditions God's power. What does this mean then in the practical terms? Well, first of all, when it comes to free will creatures, it says God necessarily gives freedom to complex creatures. Those gifts are irrevocable, and God simply can't withdraw that freedom, can't override it, can't fail to give it, even to those who use their freedom wrongly. But I think there's some evil that occurs in the world that isn't the result of free will. Essential kenosis also says God necessarily gives agency or self-organization to simpler entities. These gifts are irrevocable, and God can't withdraw, can't override, or fail to give agency and self-organization to simpler levels. So whatever occurs in random genetic mutations isn't free will, but God can't control at that level either. Further, I think what we call the law-like regularities of the world, the laws of nature, and even the random events that I said earlier I believe actually occur, ontological realities, God can't interrupt those to prevent evil and can't stop these random events, because God necessarily provides the impetus for spontaneity even at the quantum level, and God does so by nature. God can't control even at that level. So we can't say, well, if God fiddled around at the quantum level, God can make sure everything works out well at the macro level, at the more complex level. I say, no, God is active at the quantum level, but never in a controlling kind of way. And the randomness and indeterminacy at the quantum level is not something God can control. One more important piece, and that's the question of why it is that sometimes you and I can thwart people from using their free will and God can't. Suppose after this lecture Joe and I walk on this street that I'm watching buses go by every once in a while here, and we're in the midst of arguing, and Joe's telling me why I've got everything wrong, and he's trying to convince me, and we're in a heated argument, and he turns to step off the sidewalk into the street, and at that exact moment, one of these city buses that I'm seeing flying by right now is coming down, and he's going to get run over. It's by his own free will that he's stepping out into the street, not seeing the bus. Now suppose I'm right next to him, and I see the bus, and I reach out with my hand, grab him by the shoulder, pull him back, save his life. Obviously an act of love, I think. And yet, I somehow constrained his free will. He was freely wanting to step into the street, but I just stopped him from doing what he freely wanted to do. If that's loving for me, why can't it be loving for God? Here I think it's important to affirm a very long-standing Christian view that God is incorporeal, or is a universal spirit, ruach, nuach. God's an omnipresent spirit with no localized body. And although creatures can sometimes use our bodies to prevent evil, God doesn't have that kind of a body. Now, God can call me and you and other creatures to use our bodies to respond to God's call, to reach out and grab Joe before he steps in front of the bus. But that's different from God doing it directly. God doesn't have a localized physical body. Okay, I like to use the word almighty, kind of bringing it home. That God is mightier than all others, exerts might on all existence, and is the ultimate source of might, without being capable of acting as a sufficient cause. So this isn't a wimpy God in the sense that God doesn't do anything. This isn't a God out there. This isn't the God of deism. This is a God who's active and present and working at every level of complexity in the entire universe, but always in an uncontrolling way. Real quickly, let me talk about the 5 big ideas in this book. The first one's a summary, so I'll just kind of skip over it. But it's the argument that God can't stop evil single-handedly, that Jesus reveals canonic love, that essential kenosis comes first in God, so God simply can't control creatures or creation. Here's an important sentence, however. I want to make the claim that God creates, God acts miraculously, and can be victorious at the eschaton through uncontrolling love. I know it's a big claim. We can go into details of that later. Second big point in this book is that God is a suffering God. God is the fellow sufferer understands, to use the language of Whitehead. God is not in all respects passive or impassible, is in some respects passible. God suffers with us in our evil and feels our pain and calls us to do that with others. Third major idea is that God tries to heal to the greatest extent possible. That means that God is always working to heal, but, and here's the important claim here, God simply can't heal single-handedly. So God works in tandem with entities, communities, individuals to bring healing and wholeness to the greatest extent possible. God can't do it single-handedly. God works to the greatest extent possible, and I think some healing has to wait until the afterlife. I do believe in subjective experience beyond bodily death, or what most people call heaven. Fourth major line, God squeezes good from evil. Genuine evil isn't God's punishment or part of some plan, but God doesn't give up when bad things happen. God works with creation to try to squeeze some good out of the evil God didn't want in the first place. And God responds by offering possibilities, given what's possible, to grow, heal, and learn. And then finally, God calls us to join the work to defeat evil. That is, God wants us and all creation to cooperate, and God actually needs our cooperation, what I call indispensable love synergy. And we should respond to this call in a variety of ways. Okay. That's more than 30 minutes, I think, so I should bring it to a close. Those are the 5 big ideas.
Thank you, Johannes. Chris, you can continue.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for this elucidating presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, so you ended with your book, and actually I only had this book as a basis for my considerations. The full-blown response will be done by Johannes a little bit later. So for now, just some questions.
You know, do you have a pen that I can borrow? Go for it.
So just to reiterate, why the traditional Protestant thought, or maybe not only the Protestant dogmatics, would say that God does not want evil but allows it to happen. That's the idea of permissio, right? As he granted humankind freedom, you would say God can't prevent evil as he granted his whole creation freedom.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and so why, I was just at the beginning I would just start ask questions and maybe build on your answers then,
Yeah. So you want me to respond as you ask the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
Not I won't pile it up and then you have to have the full...
So you're going to argue me into a corner. I see where this
goes. Let's see. I asked myself, why does this idea fit so much better for imagining God's love?
So I think it fits for a number of reasons. One, many people have the intuition that love does not control. Some even think it a priori true. I'm not making quite that kind of claim. I'm making an a posteriori claim that if God could control and if God is loving, God should and would prevent the genuine evils of the world.
Mm-hmm. I thought so, that
Good.
you would answer that, and I would, for the start, I would say, yeah, sounds reasonable, but let's see. I will come back to that. Yeah.
Good.
Second thing is, you wrote, ultimately evil is evil, from God's perspective and ours.
Yes.
So, this is of course a big topic we didn't discuss in depth, and it would be a whole book to discuss it alone. But I ask myself, do we ever have a God's eye view?
No.
So, well, how do you know?
I don't. That is a claim that I can't say I know with certainty. But at that point in the book, I'm saying those people who make the argument that what we think is evil is not really evil, I'm claiming that doesn't make sense with the way we look at life, the way most people read Scripture. If what we think is evil, God thinks is loving, and vice versa, then we're screwed.
Yeah, I just think also the we is not taken for granted. You know, there are cultural differences in what you regard
Sure.
good and evil, I would say. And then, but it's more like a side question to your train of thought, I admit that, because it opens up big new issues. But as you said, you solved the problem of evil, I thought maybe you know.
Yeah.
That's what it mean, I know. So, okay, you say God has no divine hand. Yeah, so he needs us to cooperate with him in indispensable love synergy. Yeah?
Yes.
But you also say God creates all things, continually influences everything, but controls nothing.
Right.
So everything is not under God's control, but under God's influence. And then you say, because a loving God didn't make us and others robots, good and bad are possible. So I ask myself, if now God can influence every level, if something that looks bad to us at least, or something that looks like evil, happens, for how do you know this is evil on every level? Because the other levels, you say, have their own degree of freedom, or you seem to argue like that. And just take the virus who wants to survive, if you want to say so. If you grant this entity freedom, it would be bad for our level of survival, right? If it's a deadly virus.
That's why I make the claim of overall well-being. So I have to somehow ask the question, what's good for the whole, not just good for the individual?
For the whole of
the universe. Everything.
So you take it for granted that how we interpret the whole of the universe is the whole of the universe.
I take it for granted that we have to make some assessment of what good and evil is in our lives. And in fact, I make even stronger claim, we inevitably do.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we're wrong about it, since we inevitably do, we have to then come to terms with the question of evil, or proper evil.
I would think we can't avoid an anthropocentric perspective, but we should avoid anthropocentrism, nevertheless.
Yeah.
So we are somehow, actually I liked a lot of your book, so, and also I want to say this just in between, I think it's a very thought-provoking and stimulating book, especially if you have more traditional thoughts in your mind, and it's written for a broad audience, so this is, it's worth a read. Definitely.
Thank you.
So, now, keeping on with the indispensable love synergy thing, the cooperation that's necessary between us, between God's love and ours. So you say also healing requires cooperation, and because God is spirit, God cannot exert divine bodily impact. We should blame creation's processes for natural disasters, freak accidents, unexplained illnesses and more. And it builds on the last question maybe, why are the processes to blame? They are just, for them, it's maybe not bad, so we would answer similarly that the overall picture would direct to...
so the overall well-being would be the, blame sounds as if maybe the natural processes have free will. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying that the natural processes are a part of the system, and when they go awry, when they go wrong, and the whole system suffers, that's genuine evil. Mm-hmm. It makes the world worse than it might have been. Okay,
so thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Now come to the meat of it. Okay. Now it's more clear what you say, even clearer, let's say. I just put it maybe with my own words now. I think my main problem is that for me, love is essentially free.
Okay.
So there's no priority for love over freedom, but if there wouldn't be freedom within love, it would be love, it would be something else. So I can't prioritize love over freedom. And that's why the system, in its beginning, for me, has a crack, you know? Mm-hmm. That's maybe although I like very much the direction in which you argue, it's that's my main concern and my main problem is I think after thinking about it with how you argue, because something just influencing without granting freedom, and also without out of a free choice to reach out, it wouldn't be love for me. Yeah.
So if God has to love, it's not genuine love because it's not free. Good. That's a really good point. I sometimes ask people a series of questions, and maybe I'll return the favor and ask you questions. The first question is this. Could God stop loving the world?
I know in which direction you will argue if I say yes or no.
Well, how about if I not put you on the spot and I'll just talk about the normal person. Most people will say, yes, God could stop loving because love is inherently free, which is kind of what you're saying. I don't agree with them, but most people say, yep, God could stop. So then I usually follow up with the next question. I say, would God stop loving? Would God choose to not love? And most people say, no, God wouldn't do that. And I say, well, why? They say, well, that's just who God is. God wouldn't be acting like God if God stopped loving. Which I think is a kind of indirect way of saying they really think God's nature is love. And that they really...
I think that the difference is between maybe that my idea of freedom is a material freedom which is filled by love. So that's why I view it together. And when you use the word freedom, you always sketch sorts of arbitrary freedom. like the opportunity to have a free choice. I have the impression, at least. A free choice, like, could be that, or could be totally different, yeah? And for me, I have a concept of freedom which is more like doing the best. And, yeah.
I would say freedom is always limited to options, so you can't do anything, but you really do have choice amongst the options. So yeah, that's good. Thank you so much.
Well, it's just a start.
Yes, that's good.
Now a full trial.
No, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Andreas. Well done.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Happy to be here and discuss your theories with you. I agree with a lot of things you say. That's why I chose those topics I don't agree with.
Good. Good.
And in my handout, I've planned or prepared 3 of your theses, and I hope I formulated them in a correct way. If not, please help me to put your points a little more precise. One, where is it? God is love. The second thesis, whoever loves aims at setting free the beloved entity, and whoever loves cannot control the beloved entity. And the first topic actually fits very well to what we've discussed before. It's like that crack that Andreas talked about, which is very close to what the definition of love is, or what are the requirements of true love. And since I'm very close to your position, I also want to argue from different viewpoints. Like, what would a proponent of this theory say to you?
Yes.
And I want to make his counter or her counter argument as strong as possible.
Good.
Now, the standard open theist, I mean, you also count yourself a little bit like an open theist, but you know there's a difference between your view and the majority of open theists.
Yes.
That they have the premise, exactly what Andreas said, that love logically requires libertarian free will. So I can only love a person if I have the power not to love her or him. That doesn't mean that I need to have the power to hate. It doesn't have to be the exact opposite, but at least not the power to love. Love is incompatible with force, with control in that sense. And the question is that power a direct or an indirect power? Like your response, could God just stop loving? I don't think that's a good counter-argument to that position, because most open theists are restrictive libertarians. They believe, especially Greg Boytas, that in irreversible character formation. That works for God as well as for man. So the question is not, can God change his mind in the future? It's like God can make promises, and if he is morally perfect, he cannot break the promises. And if God decides to love creatures, he does not have to stop. The question is, was there in the past a time where he could have decided otherwise? That's the real question. And now open theists, they have a really interesting solution to that problem. They say, okay, once God has created creatures, he cannot not love them. Or he cannot stop loving them. But still, there is a libertarian element in this love because he could have chosen not to create. And for open theists, that creatio ex nihilo is really important. Because for them, that's the fundament, or the foundation that God can truly love creatures. For them, essentially loving God would not really love. And a separate view, very close to that, is what I call divine voluntarism. And you mentioned voluntarism is that the will comes paramount, or is paramount. And they would go even further. They'd say love does not require the indirect power to do otherwise, but actually an immediate, direct power to do otherwise. And they would say it doesn't matter whether God could have chosen to create or not to create the world. Usually they affirm that he could have not. But for them it's important that God could actually create the world but not love his creatures. He could just like create the world and say, I don't care anymore.
Right.
That would be, I call that moderate divine voluntarism, because there's an even harder view. And that is a hard divine voluntarism. So that would include that God can decide by his will what good and bad is. Whatever God wants or wills is good. We know that from Plato's Euthyphro problem.
Right.
It's one possible solution. And that for me, of course, goes way too far, but just to be complete, that is a position that has often been defended in history. And a lot of hard deterministic views like John Calvin's require such a case. I mean, God can just condemn a billion people to hell without they having anything done wrong. We consider that wrong, morally wrong, but for God, if God wills it, then that's good.
That's right, yeah.
So that are kind of different positions where you can challenge this view. Love is logically paramount in God. Above, and that's like your view, above freedom, omnipotence, and omniscience. And they would say, no, freedom, you cannot put love above freedom because they're on the same level, because love requires freedom in some sense or another. From a completely different viewpoint, you probably have talked to some Thomists,
yes.
And I'm here as a Catholic theologian, so I should at least mention the Catholic position here. And Thomists, and you put them very on the right. Did I remember that right? On point 7, like the Mr.
No, I would put him on I would put Thomas on the essentialist, but say it's God's natural attributes that are essential.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Thomas can say God would choose to stop existing.
Yeah.
So he's essentialist in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the moral attributes, I think he would say God can choose to stop loving. Maybe he's wrong about that. But, yeah.
So what Thomists do is they use analogy a lot. They
Right.
say we cannot define God with terms that we usually apply to humans.
Mm-hmm.
And God's love to us is a different kind of love than our love. There might be some similarities, but according to the doctrine of analogy, the difference are always greater.
And it's Thomas's doctrine of analogy, which I reject, but we'll...
Yeah? And if that is true, we cannot say anything about God's essence.
Right.
We can only say about God's relation toward us. And even here, we can only talk in comparisons and analogies. If we do that, however, we can argue for an intervening God, because God's love is similar to the love of a father to his or her child. The long-term goal is to empower the child. But as a short term, sometimes you need to intervene. You got to stop your child stepping over the cliff or so, to empower and enable his freedom in long term. And you already responded to that. God does not have a body. He cannot do that. He would if he could, right? And maybe one last thing here on the God is love. You refer to Philippians.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the word kenosis comes from. So he emptied himself. You discuss different ways of understanding that. You don't understand it as a change in God, and that God has some attributes and then lays off certain attributes. But where you actually very close to traditional kenoticists is that they also say love is the essential or is paramount in God. Exegetes would question how you can deduce something like that from a biblical paragraph.
Right.
Especially, and I talked to some exegetes about that, most of them do not interpret the kenosis in a way that there's the pre-existent logos who lay down his attributes, but actually it refers to Jesus Christ's life himself. So his emptying himself is just taking a different form, does not behave as being God, or does not ask to be treated as God, but puts himself in a situation where he's treated as a slave. And here the question is, maybe that even helps your theory, but how you deal with the exegetical ideas. I have two more sheets of paper, but because this fits best with what we discussed before, and maybe I'd like to respond to these points.
Okay.
And then if we have time or after a break, I have more input, but it's optional. Maybe others have questions, and then we can substitute that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Very good. I think you do a very nice job of laying out some of my main points, in the first part there. I also think you very well articulate, I'll call it the standard openness view, which is that God initially existed alone, and then for whatever reason, maybe an outpouring of love from the Trinity or whatever, voluntarily decided to create something out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. And they would say that that was motivated by love, freely, as you rightly put it. But then once the commitment is made, then God can't, or at least not all of them say can't, but some of them, like Greg will say, God can't decide not to continue the love relationship. It's kind of interesting because if they criticize me for having a God who doesn't have the capacity not to love, who loves by nature, and they think that that's somehow incompatible with love because love is always free, their view has God loving at the very beginning, but then after that not really being loving because God then has to love given the previous act of love. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but no, he's still loving because love does not require that at the moment you love that you have the power to do otherwise. It's very similar to moral responsibility. Yeah. And I don't know if you know the moral tracing stuff in ethics that is discussed. So the question is, if I'm, so for example, I drink a lot of alcohol, I go out and I drive my car and I run over a person. Mm-hmm. It could be that in that moment I do not have the power to do otherwise because I'm drunk, I'm not really capable of rational decision making. But still I'm morally responsible because in the past I did something which was wrong and I could have and should have foreseen the consequences.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
So what I do is apply this moral tracing idea from moral responsibility to love. In order to genuinely love, I do not have to possess the power to change my mind anytime. I just need to be praiseworthy for starting or engaging in this relationship.
Interesting, yeah. I still think it is susceptible to my criticism, but I'll try to figure out a better way to articulate it. Yeah, the moderate, divine, voluntarist, and the hard ones, I'm not attracted to those. I think you do them well. I think the analogy material from Thomas is highly problematic because analogy is used by Thomas in what I call unilateral analogies rather than bilateral analogies. Usually when we think about analogy in our everyday common life, we talk about how one thing is similar to another thing and the similarity runs both ways. Thomas only wants it to have the similarity to go one direction, unidirectional rather than bidirectional. And because of that, I don't think we end up having analogies like we usually think they're analogies. So, what was I going to say in addition to that? Oh, because of that then, I think that Thomas can fudge. Thomas can say God acts loving and it be similar to what we think is loving, but in instances in which it doesn't seem similar, they can say, well, in that case, that's God beyond our capacity. It's a different, that's something even greater. The analogy isn't bilateral or bidirectional there. Anyway, I do a lot of stuff in my book, The Nature of Love, on Thomas and analogies, in case you're interested. The last one I think is really important. I am not adopting the traditional idea that Jesus sets aside certain attributes and takes the form of a human. That usual canonical, I'm setting that aside. I'm going with a more contemporary way that people talk about kenosis in Philippians and others, but mostly in Philippians, which says that Jesus, as you rightly I think said, acts in a particular way, and this action reveals something about who God is. The issue, though, as I tried to say earlier, is that the Philippians passage, I agree with your friends who are exegetes, doesn't tell us whether or not God acts in this way because it's God's nature to do so or God voluntarily does so. I'm making the extra step that the Bible doesn't require but also doesn't undermine. to say this kenosis is essential to God, not contingent.
So it's kind of like the way how Jesus lived, the priorities he set, the way he exercised love.
Yes.
That shows us how God's nature is like.
Exactly, yes. So exactly, yeah. That's how I would put it. Yeah. It doesn't, the text itself doesn't require that interpretation, but it also doesn't exclude it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, your second thesis, in my words, is whoever loves aims at setting free the beloved entity. Now, what is that setting free? It depends, what you already mentioned, to what kind of creature or entity the love is directed to. And the first subthesis would be God necessarily acts in his creation to promote self-organization and law-like regularities. Second, God necessarily acts in his creation to let more complex structures evolve. And God necessarily acts in his creation to let conscious, free, intelligent persons evolve. It's like a maximum stage of complexity. Well, maybe they're even higher, say, we don't know what the future will bring.
Yeah.
But complexity is a good thing. Autonomy, self-organizations are all good things. And God wants them for their own sake. And that is where open theists, again, would have checked. They would say the main goal, the main purpose of God to create the universe was to engage in loving relationships with creatures. Now, if loving relationships require free, conscious, intentional persons, and that's the open theist premise. If that is true, then God cannot form a loving relationship with a stone, and not even with an animal, but only with a person who is able to love and also able to reject this offer of loving communion. And if that is true, self-organization, law-like regularities, complex structures, viruses are all means to a higher goal and not worth or value in itself. So that's a distinction. I'm here to point out the distinction between the views. And the question is, how is exactly what is love? Is there a definition of love that subsumes this idea, but also this relationship to entities, to inanimate or animate entities, where love means something different. It means to promote their possibilities, to promote a higher grade or stage of organization.
Well-being.
Yeah, well-being. From a different perspective, an eternalist, like the Thomists, they would have a problem with the idea that God necessarily acts, or that acts in creation at all, or suffers with creation, because for Thomists, God is timeless. Outside of time, immutable, unchangeable. So a timeless entity cannot act in time, and God cannot act in his creation. And here there are two good responses, and I am here I would defend your view against the eternalists, because the strong response would be, to love, you need to be personal, and to be personal means to be able to act intentionally and to have other attributes that are incompatible with timelessness. And you probably go that route. But even if you do not, if you think that an eternal, a timeless person is possible, there is a way of defending how this eternal God acts in time. And that's what usually neo-Thomists do, is that God has this universal decree that includes all contingency plans for all possibilities that could be, and includes God's actions, how he would respond in these different possibilities. So God might have known from the beginning of time, if there ever was a Johannes in a very difficult situations, if he spoke this prayer, then God would have answered to this prayer in a certain way. And he can build all that into creation, into the law-like regularities. He does not have to change them, which he can't, but he can build his way of working in creation into these regularities.
Sounds like a version of Molinism.
No, not necessarily, because here God needs to know how I would act in a certain situation.
Yeah.
With the contingency plans theory, he only needs to know all of his possible, all of the possible ways I could freely act and how he would respond. How he would respond. Among Romanists, that was discussed as a way, and it was called reflexive middle knowledge.
Oh,
because God knows what he would do in a certain situation.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's a big criticism against open theism. And what you also said is that God freely decides at every moment how he expresses his love.
Right.
And a God who knows all possible futures does not have to make that decision. He can make that decision ahead. Because I can make a decision for tomorrow. If scenario A happens, I would do this. If scenario B happens, I would do that. I usually reconsider my decisions in advance because there's new information coming.
Right.
But God knows all possibilities, all future timelines.
I'll respond to that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So just two quick more. One is the criticism by deism. Self-organization, they would say it's just randomness. Those who think God created the world but does not intervene. Complex structure evolved from random natural selection, and conscious, free, intelligent persons result from highly complex but yet random structures. How does your view differ from the idea that everything is random? Because you think God some way acts in the creation to promote higher self-organization. Does that imply it's not just pure randomness? Is that like a kind of manipulation of randomness to make higher organization more likely than falling back in a lower organizational grade? So, is that a way of understanding fine-tuning? Is there a fine-tuning in the universe in your view? A response to that view, or what is also related, is the question, how does mind come into the universe? Is that mind just also a higher form of self-organization? Or is, with a perspective, I perspective, is there something really new coming into the world that cannot be explained just from higher organization? And the very last point is God promoting welfare sounds a lot that God is a utilitarian. Because he evaluates, well, the welfare of the virus, the welfare of the simpler being of the animal, the welfare of the human being. All in all, the human has a lot more potentials to actualize than the virus. So he can have like more different kinds of pleasure and also different kinds of pain. And so I'm just doing a qualitative evaluation, and God does that, what is the best? Does that leave any freedom to God, or is he just the perfect utilitarian who weighs the possibilities and the risks?
Thanks again. Thanks again, and you may respond.
Okay. Oh, you asked lots of questions. I'm not sure which one to start with.
And you don't have to cover all. It's just some impulse.
Well, first of all, I think the way you've characterized my very first statement, I wouldn't put it in that language. I wouldn't say God aims at setting free the beloved entity, because that sounds kind of like the capacity is there for the entity not to be free. My view is that the entity, if it's complex enough to have freedom, if it's not complex, it has some sort of agency or whatever, that is inherently the case because God necessarily provides that agency, self-organization, freedom, depending on the complexity.
So what do you mean with provides?
Acts as a necessary cause in the coming to be of any entity. So God, here's Andreas. Time is going this direction. Andreas's life, we'll say his mind, is comprised of moment by moments. Every single moment begins divine action, offering a realm of possibilities. I'll make these O's options that are relevant to this particular situation in Andreas's life. These options emerge because Andreas lives in a relational matrix of other entities, including his past selves. And these actions occur that generate these possibilities. God acts and lures, calls, commands, persuades, woos, entices, whatever. Andreas to choose amongst the best in this moment. Andreas can act then. So this action here by God is a necessary cause in the coming to be of Andreas in this particular moment. And then when Andreas chooses one of these, God's calling him to choose one of the best. Then the next moment emerges and we have more options. So moment by moment, God is causally efficacious and never a sufficient cause, but a necessary cause in every moment of Andreas' life. I can't remember why I put that up there. I was responding to your question of how does God act, or yeah.
Why do you need that at all? Why can't God just create a world with these open possibilities, with mechanisms that those people or higher, more and more complex entities evolve that have these options?
Yeah. One of the great advantages here, from my way of thinking, is that this can have a personal God, a God who's relational. So what Andreas chooses to do at this moment then becomes a new piece of information for the next moment. So this giving and receiving God, the way, maybe you didn't mean this, but the way it could sound is that like God sort of is a deistic God who starts things off, inserts all the possibilities in the system, and sort of sits back as unaffected. This system has a God who's really affected, and that fits better with most of the way people think about love, but also helps in my worry that you have that God can somehow do all the calculations and know exactly what's best. In my theory, God has to bring in this new information in any particular moment to then respond, which just means that God can freely choose amongst options. Yeah.
Just ask, isn't this exactly the Whiteheadian approach?
This looks very much like Whitehead, yes. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything here different from Whitehead. What my proposal that's different from Whitehead has to do with God and God's nature, and God's nature being that which constrains God's actions. Whitehead talked about God being in the clutches of creativity, and Whiteheadians have talked about certain metaphysical laws that even God must obey. I'm not opposed to those. I just don't think that way of talking can overcome some of the problems that emerge because they sound as if there are external constraints upon God. And I'm trying to make those constraints from God's nature.
I had the question, what is God's contribution? And you answered, I have the same intuition, this is the Whiteheadian answer. In Whitehead, God provides the possibilities. Yes. But my question is, you spoke of an action of God, but Whitehead, I don't think that he would say this is an action, but because God is his primordial nature, he is the realm of possibilities, he's just there.
Yes. So I have a combination of a Whiteheadian God and a Hartsonian
So
God.
that's a difference between you and Whitehead.
Yes, that's right.
But wouldn't you say that he does more than just creating the options?
Yes.
Because he's kind of like luring toward
Yes.
the better options. And how does he do that? Does he make one option more likely than the other?
It all depends on the agent involved and the capacity for the agent to respond. I mean, the usual kind of explanation we have is that when we feel our conscience being pricked toward doing something, or we have a certain feeling that this is the right thing, or the better thing, or the more beautiful thing, or the more true thing, then we think, well, maybe use Christian language, that's the Holy Spirit active in our life. To use Whiteheadian language, God is acting to offer the possibilities and graded relevance and to lure us toward those which are most beneficial. Whoops.
But again, Johannes' question, how does he do this? Is God selecting among the infinity of possibilities, selecting the most adequate ones?
No, I don't think. I think all of the possibilities God must present because God is also related to the actual world, it would be very problematic if God could take all of the actual world and the possibilities that emerge and just say, I'm only going to offer a few, right? Because then the problem of evil would surface again. So they all have to be offered because God is also related. Then the question is, what is God calling us, to use Christian language, luring us? And your question is, how does that actually happen? Well, the language that we have to move to is philosophical or religious, because we can't, at least most people think we can't, I think we can't, look out in the world and say, well, there's God acting and there's God acting, because we can't see God with our five senses. And if God's truly omnipresent, you couldn't pick out one thing of God and not another. So you can't say how in the sense of empirically looking with our five senses. What Whitehead wanted to say is that we have the capacity to perceive God non-sensorially, or what he called causal efficacy, perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And so, again, the question is, how does God do that? The way he can say is just for some sort of philosophical or metaphysical scheme to say God is a cause in the world, and God's cause lures us toward the best, without empirically saying there's God and there's God.
So this is a perfect moment to introduce patristics.
Good.
The question of God directly influencing or not influencing our choices was discussed by Pelagius and Augustine really thoroughly, and it's about the question of the freedom of choice. And Pelagian solution for the things that you are trying to do would be an absolute free will, meaning we have choices, we are responsible for the things that we choose. And your model is more Augustinian in the sense that there is a grace that is the first thing that is given to us. It inspires us to make the right choices. But this solution brings with itself, of course, the question of the free will, which you choose to limit not only with the humans but also within the God. And it seems to me when I think about the solution in general that you offered here, that, sorry for my language, but it's a bit of cheating, because you asked the question in a different way. The question was, how is it possible that the God who knows exactly what will happen in the future, that's omnipotent, that can prevent things also, how is it possible to explain the existence of evil in that case? And I think your solution is good, and you should probably be very happy that you are not living in the 4th century, but today, because if you were living in the 4th century, you would probably burned by now. But some of your ideas are not so strange for the patristics. For example, the idea that God suffers with us, the Cyril from Alexandria,
yes.
At the point when they introduced this thought, it was also a heretical thought, because of the Greek concept of God, who is completely not able to suffer and other things. So I think the solution is very personal one, and it makes God closer to the humans. What I would probably do, if you are not a Catholic, so you don't have to worry about the Rome or something, but I would probably move the entire solution in the area of Christology. And I would probably say all of these things that you said are true, but for Christ as a middle being, and he has this role to make a bridge between us and between God, and with him you could have much less doctrinal problems for this solution. Just a thought. So.
I would probably want to say, my Christology would probably sound heretical to you, but I would want to say, I wouldn't want to talk about Christ as kind of a bridge. I would want to talk about Jesus as a revelation of God. And then I think, get all the mileage you see that I can get out of it, and then make the claim that, as I was telling Joe earlier, that this revelation tells us something about who God essentially is, God's nature. That's obviously a claim I can't prove, but I think that model makes better sense out of evil, for instance, than alternative ones. I wanted to go back to another one. If there's so many things I could say about this. near the end, I wrote mind emerge innate in the universe. I can't remember exactly what I was going to say, but you were talking about, does God manipulate in the random processes for mind to emerge, something like that? Yeah. So here, I'm going to sound like Whitehead again. I'm a dual aspect monist. I think that the fundamental units of reality have both a physical and a mental dimension. So the only problems I have in terms of mind emerging is in the complexity of the mentality. So the emergence of consciousness. So, you know, there's all kinds of language that gets thrown around, philosophy of mind stuff. I say my emergence is a smooth emergence. So there's no supernatural kind of intervention. That mentality over time can can be organized in such a way that consciousness can emerge. It's a strong emergence in the sense that something new really occurs, but it's not strong in the sense that it requires some sort of supernatural act or something that comes that's entirely different in kind from previous.
So you believe matter has proto-mental attributes?
Something like that, yeah. Yeah. I call it, again, dual aspect monism, which is Polkinghorne likes that language as well.
Although I wouldn't be sure if he extends the mind part of this spectrum up into the lowest matter, you know.
I thought he did, but you know him better than I do, so I thought he had it as a speculative theory. He doesn't have consciousness at the quantum level, but I think he has some kind of mentality. Anyway, so one other thing, there's so many things
So that higher organization happens, that more and more complex structures evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Is that simply a random thing that happened?
No.
Or is there some way, or these proto-mental attributes, for example, do they order matter in a way that makes this higher organization more likely?
They have a role to play.
They're causally active, right?
Causally active, but
Yeah.
God has a role to play as well. So it's not just mentality at the lower levels.
God enables the options, or God constitutes the
God
options, and the entities are programmed in a way that that it's more likely for them to take the option of higher organization than the one of destruction.
I wouldn't say programmed, I would say just like you have choices in the words you have right now, obviously at a much higher level and complexity level than at the smaller level. That there's
Adam
the option.
cannot have a choice.
I agree with that. I don't think it's free will, but I think
Yeah.
it's responsiveness. So there's spontaneity there. Anyway, I think one of your most interesting questions is one that I'm continuing to work with, and that is your claim about utilitarianism. I use the language of common good because in Catholic circles that's appropriate. But what's the real difference between the common good and utilitarianism? If the common good is asking the question, what's good for the whole, that sounds an awful lot like utilitarianism without all the little difficulties of, you know, cutting off someone's arm to give it to someone, those kinds of weird things.
The single person has to suffer for the common good.
Yeah. And since I don't have a God who could actually do that anyway physically, I don't have some of those worries coming up. So I remember talking with John Hare at Yale University one time about this, and he said, you know, my father, R.M. Hare, he said, he used to say the best ethical system is theistic utilitarianism. I thought, yeah, I kind of like that. So then I'm trying to say, so what's the downsides of this? It would be a downside if God has the capacity to rob from Peter to pay Paul. And God could make some people suffer in order for someone else. But the God I have can't do that, so that sort of pulls out the rug of that worry of utilitarianism. What other kinds of worries should I have to worry about?
Burning heretics was justified by theistic utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Because that suffering actually enables them to reject their heresy, and that makes it more likely for them to go to heaven despite their being heretic. That was the justification for not just killing them, but burning them slowly.
I can see how it can be abused, for sure.
Yeah.
So then the question is, is there any sort of sacrifice that would be important? And here I'm quite open to self-sacrifice. I can see how that could be abused in and of itself as well. But self-sacrificial love, I can see that working in a utilitarian sort of concept. The problem would be if I require you to sacrifice yourself, or I sacrifice you. That would be, problematic. Anyway, I continue to work with that, but I'm drawn towards something like a utilitarian.
I haven't thought that through either.
Yeah.
Just it puzzled me because that comes up. I think that the big difference between regular utilitarianism and theistic utilitarianism is that some eschatological character formation is important for the theistic utilitarian. So it's not about pleasure in this world, but it's also about pleasure in the eternal union with God.
Also, yeah. In addition,
also, not only, because that would also shift.
Yeah.
They have to be in some balance.
Yes.
But the results are totally different from if you only integrate worldly pleasure and pain.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, one final comment, and then I don't know if we're going to.
We do not have to. So
okay.
If people want to discuss these issues, I'm happy.
Just one quick thing. I think one of my criticisms to what you call, or what we are calling, the traditional open theist view, is it means that God really doesn't love animals. And I think that's just a pity. Now, if God doesn't love animals, then why should I? God doesn't love the planet.
Well,
except the creatures on it like us who require the planet, so it's only utilitarian, it's sort of a extrinsically valuable. Man, I like the system that says God thinks all creation is intrinsically valuable, not only because it fits the way I hang out with animals on the planet, but also it motivates me to care about climate change and care about animal suffering. And I don't know, I just find that vision much more appealing.
Quick answer to that.
Go for it. Yeah.
I don't love animals, but I care about animals, and I see that I have a moral obligation not to harm animals just for my own pleasure.
What's the difference between love and care there?
Like, true, it says like the highest form of love is the mutual love.
And you don't think you can have mutual love with animals? You need to hang out with my dog.
At least not that the animal has the free will to decide not to engage in that loving relationship. It's all about this premise from the first page. If love requires libertarian freedom, then those who do not have libertarian freedom cannot love in the fullest sense.
Yesterday I was out in the garden at a photo break, and I came around the bend, and there was a big rabbit there. And I started talking to the rabbit in English, and I later realized they must only know German. But I was trying to, in that talking, set the rabbit at ease. I was actually trying to promote the rabbit's well-being. And I did it in part because I wanted to have something like a relationship with that rabbit at the time. For my good, because I find it pleasurable, but also for the good of the rabbit. I wanted to, make it feel better. It seems like it goes beyond just caring for the rabbit's good. There seemed like, now the rabbit didn't cooperate very well with me. He ran off. But I like to think that that's possible and fits the way I live my life. But maybe I'm just a weirdo. Who knows? Anyway, you're getting ready to jump in.
Perhaps it is already sufficiently answered, but in your lecture you also talked about creational cooperation.
Yeah.
How can this be thought, especially on the subhuman level?
Yeah.
With uncomplex entities, how can they cooperate?
Yeah. So I tried to use two different kind of phrases. The idea that creation cooperates, or that creation is aligned or conducive. And I used that language to try to account for both responsive agents, organisms, etc., and also inanimate objects, like this table. I don't think this table responds qua table, as table in and of itself. I think it's comprised of entities that have some kind of responsiveness, but the table, qua table, I don't think can respond. So that's why when I talk sometimes about God acting in the world and trying to act miraculously, and things can occur that are extraordinary, not because the table or the rocks respond to God, but because things are aligned in nature, inanimate objects are aligned for those kinds of things to occur. So I want both kinds of cooperation and alignment, because I think the world is structured in those kinds of ways, organismic and inanimate aggregates, that kind of thing.
Okay, thanks. If there are no other questions to this one, you can continue with T3. What do we have?
I'm not sure if it's now fit, but the question comes up when you put here the Whiteheadian explanation. Perhaps I missed your point, but what about God and love and the first act of creation?
Yeah. So here I have a wild proposal. I think God creates in every moment out of that which God created in the previous moment, and there was no initial first creation. God is everlastingly creating. Yeah, what do you think of that?
It's not a new idea.
No, I'm not the first. My particular way of putting it, I think, is new, but the general idea is not new. Because I think the way a lot of people have talked about it, it sounded as if when God began to create our universe 13.8 billion years ago, or however long, who knows, that if you think that God created out of something else, then God must have stumbled upon some matter in the universe and said, hey, look at all this matter, I think I'm going to create. And I want to say God is a creator of all things. So this way of saying God created at the Big Bang out of the chaos of a previous universe, but God created that too, and saying that God creates at every stage along the way can help us to overcome the idea that God came upon something that God didn't create and said, hey, I think I'll make something. You don't like that very well?
I think this fits well with the biblical account.
Yeah, I think it does too.
It is said in the beginning, but the Latin translation is not in initio, but in principio. That is not at the beginning, as a time, but as a principle foundation. As beginning, not in the beginning, as beginning.
Yeah, some translations in English say when God began to create it, which sounds like it's a process. And then, of course, the Spirit covers the face of the deep, which sounds like there's something there. And
I have two remarks to that.
okay.
First is I would be cautious to combine Big Bang ideas with creation, because I think creation is more like a theological idea, and Big Bang is a scientific model, and this does not need to be related anyhow, because Big Bang model we have since 1927 earliest, and before people believed in creation and they assumed a strategic and eternal universe, right? So it must have been, just for historical reasons, already been another way to think about it. But what's more interesting for me is how would you define the idea of God?
That's an easy one.
No, because you sound like you discard the idea of aseity. So
oh, nice. Yeah, so I affirm aseity when understood as God necessarily exists. But many people have added to aseity that God necessarily exists alone. I don't think we need to add that. So I would just assume ase in God's self. That's what it literally means. So I think that means by necessity. I don't think it has to be further interpreted all alone. That's where I'm different from Thomas, for instance, and some of the others.
What about that everything else that exists depends on God?
Yes,
I think
believe
you agree with that,
Yes.
and that could be part of the definition of aseity too.
Sure, that one thing in which all other things depend. Yeah, I like that. I usually wouldn't put that under aseity, but I could see that would work nicely. Yeah. Anyway, you had a follow-up to that?
As far as I got your response, you put the first act of creation into continuous, continuing acting of God. But still, there might be the question, is there a necessity in each moment for God to create a new moment?
In my view, yes. Unlike the vast majority of Christian theologians who say God creates contingently, I say God creates necessarily. It's part of God's nature.
So my main
Yeah. So that means in every moment God necessarily creates. To put, if I went back to that other thing, it would be under the essence thing. Creating is an aspect of God's essence that's prior to God's will. So God necessarily creates, but how God creates is going to be contingent upon the options and the creatures, the creation that's there at any particular moment. Now you have another puzzled look.
So love and creation gives the same result?
I wouldn't say it gives the same result, but I would say they're both essential attributes in God. That God does them by necessity.
Could there be a love without creation?
I don't think so. Now, some people have a social trinity in which there's love within God. I'm open to that idea, but I don't require that idea for this scheme. So that's compatible with what I'm saying, but it's not a necessity.
But open theists require the idea of a social trinity.
Most of them, yes.
To maintain God's freedom not to create.
Yeah. I don't know if they require, but I can't think of any exceptions to that. So yeah, all to date have that view. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And there is always a world.
In my view, yes.
Yeah. Although like Whitehead.
Yes.
Okay.
Or maybe even more than one. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm open to a multiverse. I don't think there's any
Yeah,
evidence
yeah.
for that, but you know.
Okay. Whoever loves cannot control the beloved entity.
Yeah. Three subtheses. God cannot control the self-organized creation by changing law-like regularities. God cannot reduce the complexity of created structures. And God cannot undermine or reverse free decisions of created persons. That all are explications or consequences of the idea that God is essentially loving, and that God loves by setting, what I call setting free creation. You said it's better like promoting possibilities, promoting higher or greater organization, something like this. That means also God cannot act contrary to this.
Right.
Now I think I would restrict myself to the criticism by open theists here.
Okay.
Because they, and that puzzled me often, sometimes they advance a very strong interventionism.
Yeah.
Like God, that's your problem.
Yes.
Say sometimes God can intervene. Just important that He respects the freedom. God cannot, Greg Boyd says, God cannot take back the freedom once given to creatures. But here he only refers to freedom of persons,
Right.
of probably human beings.
Yeah.
But he would not apply that to law-like regularities or complex structures. So God could, if there's an uninhabited star system, God could just like play with the planets a little bit, if it does not affect free creatures. Because he's only bound to the natural laws for open theists, because they are either a requirement or in some ways the consequences of free acts. So that means if I shoot a gun, God cannot change the natural laws and change the projectile, the trajectory of the projectile. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Change the trajectory of the projectile to not harm you, because thereby, I mean, he would not directly change my will, but he would change the consequences. And truly respecting free will is not intervening in the decision making and not intervening in the consequences of the decision. And that's why God respects law-like regularities if they are in any way connected to free acts. Why do we need to apply that to law-like regularities and complexity in the past, in other planetary systems, other places. Okay, just so far.
Okay. So let's go to the example of the infant who has severe genetic mutations because of severe disabilities because of random genetic mutations. Now, in that case, apparently no one's using their free will wrongly. These genes are just mutating. And yet, those cases seem to produce what I would call genuine evil. They make the world worse than it might have been. We could imagine the infant being born without those severe genetic disabilities. Now, God, who has the capacity to work at this kind of level here, the smaller entities and law-like regularities, whatever, would seem to be more loving if that God somehow fiddled with the genes so they didn't have those random genetic mutations in ways that caused unnecessary suffering. So I think the problem of evil becomes insoluble if we accept that.
Which I also said as a criticism here already. It makes the problem of natural evil more problematic.
Yeah.
The answers of people like Richard Swinburne, for example, would be that what you said is only true ceteris paribus. Like God always acts if he can improve something, if he does not counteract to another value or another thing that is important.
Yes.
And it's hard to find this other thing.
Yeah,
soul-making theology is very proponent.
Yeah.
So often suffering helps for the good, and in these cases maybe there's a higher good that would be undermined if God prevented the evil. But we both agree that this solution does not work in many cases.
Yeah.
There are just cases of suffering where we cannot really see where the higher purpose is.
Yeah. It's interesting too. Some of our openness friends, to use your example of pulling the trigger, the person freely does that. They would say, nope, God can't prevent them from using their freedom. And then they would say, as you said, the projectile comes out of the bullet, or out of the gun, and now it's heading, you're shooting Mikhail right now. What's odd to me is that they should be able to say, God can move these three tables instantaneously between the bullet and Michael to stop him, because it wouldn't be thwarting your free will, it wouldn't be altering the trajectory of the bullet going toward Michael, and it wouldn't be undermining anyone's free will in the world. It would just be moving these tables to stop it.
No. It
I
will.
know they don't want
it will undermine it,
because
in order to be free, I have to be able to project the consequences of my actions. If that happens only once in 1,000 years, okay, that doesn't change it. But if God regularly intervenes, then I do not have the same
I thought that's what you were going to say. So then if we say, even moving those desks over there to stop the bullet, many of our fellow open theist friends want to say that somehow miracles involve something like that. So they want to say that miracles can occur that don't require thwarting free will or undermining the implications of free will in other places, but somehow that is compatible with not moving desks at the same time. And I have a hard time understanding that. I don't see how you can have miracles in that sense. I believe in other kinds of miracles, but not that kind of miracle.
Here they would argue similar to you, that miracles can only happen if we are opening us for the possibility.
Yeah. Or the conditions are conducive or something like that.
Exactly. So if the people involved are believing persons that pray every day for God helping them in their life, then God is not acting against their freedom by moderate intervention.
But someone like Greg Boyd is going to bring in angels and demons and say they're active as well, and they can somehow influence the physical world.
I
So
wrote,
that's good.
open theist attempts to solve the problem of natural evil are too mystical, void.
Okay. I should have read ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
good.
I see there is that's the advantage of your theory
Yes.
against standard open theism, is that you have a lot easier for you to solve the problem of natural evil.
Right.
Open theists attempt to do that by integrating that in a free will theodicy, but that is not always convincing.
Yeah, one of the other criticisms I have, and then get more questions, is that if we take that traditional open theist view to its logical extent, it begins to sound like God is managing the whole universe and is not really engaging very well with you and me personally. Because God has to make sure the whole structure is working correctly, and to tweak things on my behalf right here, that's kind of tiddlywinks. And so Mikhail won't mind this, but I have a problem with it because it seems to undermine the idea of a personal relationship with God. And that God is somehow cares for me. God cares for everybody too, but yeah, anyway. Other thoughts?
Yeah. Because I have to go in 5 minutes.
Okay.
I have one question I always pose to theologians.
Okay.
I turn to Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins said, there is not a tiny shred of evidence for the existence of God. And that is a challenge for me as a theologian. So I'm curious what you're answering. Is there any, you said several times today, I'm more attracted to God, or then Dawkins would say that's your wish, that God is love, and so very nice things. But what would you answer if I pose you the question? Is there any empirical evidence that this God you're talking about, it really exists? Empirical evidence.
If by empirical you mean
experience, maybe not only physical evidence.
Yeah. So the kinds of pieces of evidence I would put on the table, Richard Dawkins would probably reject. I would say things like religious experiences. And he would say, well, that's just evolutionary sorts of things.
Then I'm out of luck because I had never one.
Yeah.
Or you mean by religious experience a day-to-day experience, or a daily experience, a usual experience, and if God is always at every time and every place, I should experience God now, here in this room.
Yeah.
But
I'm just getting started. Then a person like me would point to aesthetic experience. Now, Dawkins might have some sort of answers there. That's to my evolutionary advantage, like some colors more than others, some shapes. I would appeal to my moral sensibility, that I think some things are just right, or at least more right than the alternatives. I might look at the world and say, wow, things to be fit. They're not perfect. There's evil in the world, no doubt. But there's also seems to be an excessive amount of design, or, design's a loaded word, but you get what I mean. At the end of the day, I couldn't prove to Richard Dawkins there's a God. But what I would say to Richard Dawkins is this: a model of reality that includes a role for God seems more plausible to me. Models of reality that don't have God in them. It's not a proof, but my intuitions about morals, my experiences, religious and otherwise, aesthetics, design, all these kinds of things fit better in a theistic framework, as I see it, than one that doesn't have God.
May I add something here real quick? I would respond that an epistemology that only allows empirical evidence is it's self-contradictory.
In other words, you have to have metaphysics to make sense of the epistemology.
Yeah.
I would add from the epistemology of natural science and the status of natural laws, which could be changed due to future experiences and other further evidence, that from this point, if you transform it on a logical question, I would simply pose a counter question. Does the fact that no ethical threat of evidence for the existence of God is true, there follows no logical necessity that this proves that God couldn't exist?
Yeah, sure.
So this is simply this.
Well, Dawkins always says he can't prove that God doesn't exist, but what's more likely? That's his question.
Yeah. So my strength is.
I'm very near to your position, and I think the experience. That's my. There is a slight attraction. In reality, a real slight attraction to the more aesthetic things or to more the well-being, and that's for me, and I treat that as an empirical fact, somehow, in this direction.
I will also add experiences transferred to us through the history. So, although it doesn't replace the necessity of a personal approach, but tradition for me is very important for keep the idea of religions about God.
Yeah, that was kind of what I said, what I was trying to say by religious experience, not just what experiences I personally may or may not have had, but in just about every culture there's some kind of religious experience of something beyond, holy other, divine, whatever. That doesn't prove there's a God, but that's another piece of evidence toward that model making more sense.
And I would relate to the topic you just brought on the table,
Okay.
the topic of miracles.
Good.
And concerning some miracles, I would agree. Concerning the natural miracles, I would have a question.
Yeah.
And I would relate to John Sanders and his critique. He puts it as the following. In his theology, Oord claims it is impossible for God to prevent storms. This is the point.
To what?
To prevent storms.
Storms, yes.
Yeah. This is your theology. God can't.
Yeah.
And then he continues, but then he turns around and says that God dissolves a storm in the New Testament approach. How is this compatible? In the preventing of evil, he can't. As a miracle, he can.
Yeah.
How does it fit?
So I would say God can't do these things single-handedly, but God can influence other entities, actors, factors in creation. That influence doesn't necessitate the result God might want, but it plays a role. So I can say these miraculous actions occur not only when God influences, but there's some kind of cooperation, or the elements are aligned and conducive. In the case of natural miracles, I don't think water cooperates. If I remember right in the context, though, I was making the claim that if we took the New Testament very seriously, there seems to be a lot of anthropomorphic language being used. Jesus says, "Peace, be still," to the storm, which sounds like, and then it says, "The wind and waves obeyed." Man, that's really anthropomorphic. Now, most people don't think that wind and waves actually obeyed. If you did, then my theory would work in terms of cooperation. If you didn't, then I would say, okay, if that really occurred, then the conditions were aligned correctly for that to happen.
Here I can agree, rather than your three models you offer for it to intervene in the quantum level, as you discuss it in your book, Uncontrolled Love. This I could agree with.
Oh, good. I've actually put something up here I was going to show you all today. Let me see if I can bring it up.
What book do you mention right now? This on the quantum level, what book do you mention?
This is
Uncontrolled Love.
the last chapter.
Last chapter, okay.
Here's the way I would try to talk about miracles now, maybe a little bit differently than I have in some other places.
Okay.
But, so I think miracles are unusual, good events that involve God's special action. We'll have to talk about what special means here. As defined, miracles don't require God acting as a sufficient cause to interrupt the law-like regularities or interfere with processes or free will, and that's etc. So in other words, I'm making the claim God's miracles involve, again, cooperation or things aligned, not God interfering, interrupting, intervening, that kind of language. But, or I should say, in addition, God God acts by providing new possibilities for life and action, given what's possible for each creature in circumstances, and then God empowers creatures to respond. God doesn't override, etc. And when doing miracles, God acts in tandem with creation. So, when I'm talking about miracles, especially like in a church setting, that's usually the number one question I get, by the way, when I'm done. Someone will raise their hand and say, yeah, but what about this miracle? Like last night when I was in church. Miracles, that's the question. So I have this little thing I put together to talk about this. I ask, because almost everybody says, yeah, but in this miracle, you know, raising of Lazarus or parting the Red Sea, in this miracle, God did it all alone. So they have a kind of traditional view of miracles in mind, that God must have, to use my language, been a sufficient cause, unilaterally made that happen. And so I have this thing where I put up the theoretical options to think about miracles. So, the one in the middle is the one I'm arguing for as the major one. Oops, I gotta turn this on. Thank you. I'm not sure why it's not
Perhaps the
going.
battery or something.
Is it on the side?
It's on the side. Okay, it's working now. All right. So the one in the middle, if any passage that explicitly talks about divine action or Jesus' action, let's say in this case, and creaturely action. So, you know, Jesus, do you want to get well? It sounds like someone has to cooperate. Or rise up and go, your faith has made you well. Or, you know, when the four friends lower their friend to the top of the house, Jesus looks up at them and says, your faith has made him well. It sounds like there's other cooperation can go on. And when Jesus goes to his hometown, it says he can't do those miracles because they didn't have faith. They didn't cooperate, to use my kind of language. So there's lots of evidence for this idea that there's tandem, miracles involve tandem work. So then I ask this question. What Bible passages say only talk about God acting? There's actually not that many. The one I put up here is kind of a general one that just basically says God's a healing God. It's not talking about a particular situation. But what I think is more interesting is those passages on miracles that only mention creatures. They don't talk about God at all. Taking him up by the right hand, Peter helped him up, and instantaneously the man's feet and ankles are healed. Or this example when Peter's going through and they just touch or they touch the garments and they're somehow healed. Those instances are healings that don't appeal to Jesus or God. Now, I, as a person who thinks God is acting, and most Christians I know think that God was active there, God's just not mentioned. But notice here, we're quickly willing to say divine action occurred when it's not mentioned. Where over here, we're not always thinking about how creaturely action might have also been at play. The New England Patriots won yet another Super Bowl this year. The headline says, Tom Brady wins 6th Super Bowl. The statement is true. But if you think Tom Brady was the only player on the field, you would be wrong. God heals. True. But if you think God's the only actor, I'm saying that doesn't make sense. Now there are two other options. What if we found a passage in Scripture that explicitly say creatures were the only causes? And God was not causally involved at all. In other words, something like this, it says, Peter healed him and God had nothing to do with it. I can't find any in the entire Bible. What about those passages that explicitly say God was the only cause and creatures had nothing? In other words, only God, and explicitly says no creation. I can't find a single one. That includes the creation of the world. That includes the resurrection of Jesus. That includes God hardening Pharaoh's heart. I can't find any that explicitly said God was the only one acting and there was no creaturely contribution. You look incredulous.
Yeah, but in the act of creation, who else should act?
Well, that's the assumption that you're bringing to the text, that there's nothing else there. And I'm looking at Genesis 1:2, and it says, the Spirit hovered over the face of the deep, and I'm saying, boy, it seems like there's something else there. Now, I might be wrong, but the Bible doesn't explicitly say when God created, God was acting all alone, and there were no creaturely entities involved. So yeah, anyway, this is the kind of thing I use to talk about Scripture and say, the Scripture doesn't require one to accept my view, but it's compatible with this idea that miracles involve divine and creaturely action of some kind.
Just a mini follow-up. So, the resurrection. How do you find the creaturely?
Yeah.
Is dead Christ, dead Jesus, or?
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue that the resurrection of Lazarus would also not very well fit into that. But Lazarus was maybe a sign for the resurrection of Jesus, so it could have been an exception.
Yeah.
But the resurrection of Jesus, at least how I learned to, it's often there are two Greek terms for resurrecting, right? It's and can you help me with the
Auferstehung auf Erweckung, oder?
Yeah, right. And it's Auferweckung in general. It's not an Auferstehung.
So resuscitation and resurrection, is that?
Yeah, and it's God who resurrects, and it's not a resuscitation.
Yeah.
Only. So Jesus just turned up by himself. Or whatever.
Yeah. Well, notice in my theory, Jesus, if Jesus is human, couldn't be resurrected without divine action. So I'm not saying it's all God, and I'm also not saying it's all Jesus. I'm saying the theory says God acts and there has to be creation, cooperation, or the conditions have to be conducive. Then I'm saying this, does the biblical passages, or do the biblical passages, explicitly say there was no creaturely contribution? I'm putting a bar here.
I would say yes, because it's new creation.
Mm-hmm. I think new creation occurs moment by moment, but just to continue with the thought, most people think that, well, most people, that's probably too strong. Many people think that when Jesus is in the tomb, Jesus' soul or mind or whatever it is that continues to exist beyond bodily death also has some subjectivity. And you would think it would want to cooperate with God. You know, some people think Jesus went to preach to the people in hell. I mean, I'm not buying into that. I don't have to buy into that view. But the idea is that there's some action.
Yeah, you can say like the body is still
there.
Before the ascension is still there.
Yeah. What makes it particularly difficult in working out the details is then trying to ask the question, what was the post-resurrection body of Jesus like? And it is a strange duck, right? I mean, it's one that can go through walls, apparently, and can walk and can't be recognized. And
shouldn't be touched.
Shouldn't be touched. The friends don't recognize him standing right next to the tomb, think he's a gardener. I mean, there's some weird things going on there. So that kind of throws a monkey wrench into any theory, including mine. It's just hard to get your head around it. But again, sort of my minimalist approach is, does the resurrection explicitly say God alone did it and there was no creaturely cooperation by Jesus or any other
I
elements?
think that's important, actually.
That what?
That it was God alone.
Yeah, well, I'm arguing that it is important, but for different reasons.
Well, to press you here, could have Jesus prevented his resurrection?
That's a great question. That has to do with the question of whether or not all will be resurrected in annihilationism. In my view, it's possible, I'm not committed to this, it's possible that Jesus could have said, nope, don't want to be resurrected. And you and I can say, when it's our turn, nope, don't want to be resurrected. I don't think that's likely.
Okay, but that decision occurs after death. Because I have a similar view. I would just say, and that's again the restrictive libertarianism, that this decision is Christ's decision to take up the cross, to fulfill his mission, to not run away in Gethsemane. Mm-hmm. That's his human contribution, and that tradition said that explicitly, that it was his human will cooperating with the divine will in Gethsemane, when he said, my will and not yours be done.
Right.
And by this, he made the necessary prerequisite for the resurrection and for the salvation of mankind.
So something that Jesus did prior determines the later.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have a hard time with that view if by determined we meant there was no possibility to do otherwise. I wouldn't have a problem with it if it meant it placed a condition for a choice in the future in a particular way. I can buy that.
Because God is essentially loving, especially in your view. So if the conditions are met, of course he resurrects, and of course he saves humanity.
Exactly.
He just cannot do it unilaterally, because if he could, we did not need Jesus.
Well, I wouldn't quite say it that way, but yeah. Yeah.
Matthias.
It comes here to the miracles and just your command, don't do otherwise. So I'm a little bit worried about your concept of law-like regularities. What does it really mean? So if you want to clearly define the concept of miracle, think of human analysis. You have, even with your event metaphysics, some metaphysical connections, and put it in science phrase, some mathematical connections, which somehow really didn't give any logical possibility to have any exceptions from this law-like behavior. That's the I think fair explanation of the concept of a natural law. So natural law-like regularities means perhaps your statistical regularities you mention on the, or you can see on the quantum level. But here it's very much harder to define any clear concept what a miracle might be or not. So, for example, the decay of a nuclear atom, so maybe a poor accident, and the difference to a miracle might simply be this accident might have no meaning for me. So, I'm a little bit, as I said, worried about this concept. So there's somehow either or no position, I think.
Can you articulate your question a little bit more precisely? I was following you and I had a kind of answer, and then you said something else and then I lost.
Okay.
So you're worried about the relationship between law-like regularities and miracles. Can I affirm both of them?
No, I think it was about natural laws, mathematical laws, which doesn't allow exceptions.
Oh,
About irregularity, so I think it's the distinction made already by Kant, but regularities just applies most often of the time, but not always. It's a really strict limitation of what a law might be or could be if you define it from the concept. So, and this might be the touchstone to define most clearly the concept of miracles, in my opinion. But speaking of law-like regularities, which might have at the quantum level, as I meant, it's more difficult to speak of any or make the distinction between miracles and just poor accidents or whatever.
Yeah. So, there's so many ways I could go with this. I do think that we live in a world with great deals of regularities. I'm reticent to talk about natural laws because that language, thanks to David Hume and thanks to philosophers of science who frame that in terms of mathematics, as you were talking about, can easily end up sounding quite deterministic, as if the mathematics require, by necessity, particular outcomes. But if I go down that road, then all of a sudden I'm going to have a hard time having, you know, indeterminacy anywhere. I mean, unless it's tightly constrained, these natural laws. So what I'm prone to do is to say, yes, these law-like regularities are in the world. I don't put them in some sort of divine imposition, like placed by God. I think talking about Euthyphro's dilemma again. God wills those kinds of things to be in the world, and they can't be exceptions. I think of them as as descriptive rather than prescriptive, descriptive of the way the world works in relationship to an omnipresent God whose love is active even at the quantum level. So in other words, if God is steadfastly loving, necessarily loving, use that, God's active at all levels, and if at smallest levels of reality there's far less, we'll call it, there's far less contingency, we might say, because there's some indeterminacy, then these regularities are going to emerge. And in my view, they wouldn't be absolutely determinative because there's indeterminacy there. But we would want to talk about continued regularities that then make possible the kinds of larger regularities we see in the world. And it's then in that context I'm using this idea of miracles. Not as somehow those miracles as interrupting the laws of nature or interrupting the law-like regularities, but being God's action in the world that is surprising, something we didn't expect, not metaphysically impossible, but just not something we didn't expect, in such a way that something good comes out. Well, I guess it's not up there, but my definition has the good involved. So I'm not sure that's exactly what you're asking, but that's...
Yeah, it's an idea of emerging view of law-like,
yes, yeah,
classical work.
Yes.
Okay, Andreas and Johannes, do you have a final remark?
Well,
And then the last word to Thomas.
I think I like much of your thought, and the one thing that sticks out for me as I'm saying, I want to, well, I wouldn't embrace, because I embrace so much of what you say. That you don't put freedom and love on one level.
Mm.
Where there's a spirit of the law, there is
Freedom.
Why not love? If freedom and love is on one level, then this is not a contradiction. But yeah, you know what I mean. I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your way of doing theology, because it's at the same time bold and humble.
Oh, thank you.
It's bold because you're trying to think a model of God and the God-world relationship through to the detail,
Yep.
and you improve that model. You have been improving that for many years,
Yep.
responding to criticism without playing mystery cards.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're humble because you're always aware that it's just one model,
Yep.
and that it's in a competition with other models.
Mhm.
And time will show, and academic discourse will show which model prevails and has the best answers to our problems today.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. I would add one thing that's also been different for me lately, and that is the model that I'm proposing, as you rightly say, is kind of in a competition, and its closest scrutiny is academics. But it's kind of the general public who hears it that gets most excited about it. And this doesn't prove it's the right one, but it's deeply satisfying to have the typical person on the street hear this general vision, again, that may be, you know, similar to the other open theater, but this general vision, and say, ah, this makes so much sense to me. I can believe in this God. This God loves, calls me to love, isn't to blame for evil. Again, this doesn't prove that this is the right one, but it is a little extra piece of evidence maybe that I take as this might suggest a greater plausibility of it. Yeah, thanks.
I hardly can add something to it. I fully agree, and I think you, although you have been grilled from at least two sides,
all kinds of sides here.
At least two sides, at least that you have survived greatly. Thank you for doing it, and I wish you on dear book a critical and good reception here in Germany as well. We are looking forward to initiate perhaps a translation.
Yeah.
However, so thank you very much for being here and for your flight in 2 hours to Brussels.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here as well.
Thank you, Hans. Thanks again to all of you. Thanks, Andreas. I enjoyed the conversation. And I think Joe said it well. I don't see these kinds of instances of me having to knuckle down and defend every last. I think of this way of thinking makes sense to me, but I'm going to change things, and all of your comments are going to influence me to try to make it better.
Likewise.
Yeah.